Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you for participating to our second part of the coffee break session. The coffee break session is actually a series imagined by the Frankfurt Book Fair and us in order to give the speech to experts, French and German, in order to tackle issues from the current issues, excuse me. When Paris Book Fair was cancelled, Frankfurt offered us to sustain our year-long cooperation in the B2B field, and that's how this coffee break series was born. The BF and the Frankfurt Book Fair are both respectively supported by the French Ministry of Culture and the German Federal Foreign Office. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurence, and welcome everyone, also on behalf of the Frankfurt Book Fair. Our goal with the Coffee Break series is to offer French and German experts a platform to tackle current issues that are relevant for the publishing industry. And today we go on with a more political issue, namely the way infringement on the freedom of expression can impact the international rights business in publishing. Olivia Snyder, who is a journalist and art director who covers also the publishing industry, among others for Publishing Perspectives, will lead the interview. And now I hand over to Olivia and our guest speakers.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you very much, Nikki. For today's coffee break, I'm very pleased to be speaking to Nora Mercurio and Judith Rosenzweig on the subject of rights and censorship. Nora Mercurio is the rights director at Suhrkamp Verlag, based in Berlin. She started at Suhrkamp with an internship in the year 2000 and has headed the department since 2017. And congratulations, Nora, for winning this year's London Book Fair's Rights Professional Award.
Thank you.
Judith Rosenzweig is the rights director at éditions Gallimard, based in Paris. She moved to Gallimard in 2020 from De Noël, where she was the rights director for 10 years. And before that, she worked in rights at Éditions Perrin. Since 2016, she has presided the International Commission of the French Publishers Association. People who work in rights really have their finger on the pulse of what is going on economically, politically, and socially in the world. These days, in relation to what people want to read, on the one hand, you have a great interest in gender, intersectionality, feminism, climate change, or social systems. And on the other hand, you have the rise of nationalism, polarization, or the tightening of government control. With this week, for example, the Hungarian parliament passing a law that bans gay people from being featured in school educational materials or being on TV shows for under 18s. Today, we're focusing on the issue of censorship within the global book industry, which we can define in several ways. It can be official, as in governmental censorship, or less institutionalized, but present for political and social reasons, or something more ambiguous, which exists in democratic countries that we're seeing with the advent of cancel culture, the issue of cultural appropriation, and so on. So my first question is, could you two talk about, when you're selling a book to countries with an official government censorship in place, how you prepare for your meetings, and perhaps describe certain situations you found yourself in, and how you came to an agreement with a contract? And perhaps, Judith, would you like to start?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Olivia. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending today. First, I want to stress out the point that it is part of our job in the rights sales business to be completely aware and pay much attention to the censorship issues in some countries. So it's really something that we deal with on a daily basis. And what obviously we are well aware of some touchy, sensitive topics that we will not present to publishers of those countries, namely China, for instance, or Iran. So we self-censor ourselves at the beginning, we select carefully the titles that we know won't fit in these countries. And for instance, in China, we will not present titles about China politics, China history, the Tibet issue, all the more if they are critical, of course, but also we won't present books dealing with crude sexuality or extreme violence. So we basically make a harsh selection on the titles we present to these publishers. And maybe I will let Nora go on with answering the questions, but I'd like to add as well that the censorship is not always the same in those countries. It varies according to the context or the international situation or also other conditions. So we can face situations with light censorship or heavier censorship, but I can give examples later on after Nora.
Thank you, Judith. And Nora, what's your take on this?
Well, I basically agree with Judith. So there is no specific preparation for those countries because we always try to be as best prepared as possible about each country we are selling into. So we know our markets, we know the partners, we know, if possible, we know as much as we can about the social, economic, cultural, political situation of those countries. So, and censorship and problematic situations as censorship are always part of this bigger picture. And as a preliminary statement, I might say that, of course, we want to sell rights as broadly as possible and make books travel. Ideally, all of the books, but not at any costs. So at one side, we wouldn't want to put any of our partners in those specific countries or our authors at any risk. And I wouldn't invite a Saudi Arabian publisher to publish a novel about a gay couple. So that's just something that wouldn't happen. Also, as Judith mentioned, in a very pragmatic way, I don't know if I would call it self-censorship. I think we're going to talk about another kind of self-censorship later, but very pragmatically, I have so many books on my list I would love to be translated, and there's so very few possible spaces and slots for a German translation that I need to select anyway. And obviously, I will bet on the ones that I think are most likely to stand a chance in the international context. And if I have a book that I know from the beginning is unthinkable in a certain country, I wouldn't propose it, but not just as in self-censorship, also because it would be a loss of time and go away from another book that might really have a chance and is equally worthy to be translated. So that's something that is happening always. If I have time to talk about 3 books, I will choose the 3 that I think are most likely to stand a chance. On the other hand, what might happen is I know the partners well, and generally speaking, we share a common, roughly a common ideological idea, otherwise they wouldn't probably go turn to our books in the first place. So there's a relationship of trust, and when I feel that a book can be safely published in their countries, in China, in Iran, in Russia being a little different than China and Iran, but I suspect that there's something in the book they might even not know about in the very beginning, but that might cause problems, I will mention it, to be very transparent from the beginning. And as Judith said, censorship is not, it's not a fixed construction. So it's very dynamic and it's changing, and something that might have been possible to publish 5 years ago is unthinkable today. To make an example, in China, where there's both a very institutionalized censorship and a very strong contemporarily a self-censorship and a self-control that works bottom up. We hear now from publishers that it's impossible to publish something around the year 1989, which for us is the year where the wall came down, but for them it's the year has another historical connotation in Chinese history, so it's a taboo now. It's a no-go area. But 5 years ago we sold Crusoe from Lutz Seiler to China, and the book has been published. His second novel, less political in a certain way from the first, is not sold. So yes,
you really have to stay on your toes in terms of knowing what will go through and what's acceptable. But that leads us to my next question about countries where there's a less institutionalized policy and how you deal with selling rights where there's more of a political and socio-cultural censorship, which I believe that Judith mentioned or was going to get to. Perhaps, Judith, you can talk to us a little bit about that, and then we'll move on to Nora.
Yes, absolutely. What I wanted to add first is that not only, as Nora said, we absolutely don't want to put our fellow publishers in those countries in danger, of course not, but also we have the duty to guarantee the moral rights of the author. So when the censorship is applied to a book, we have to get the author approval on the cuts requested by the foreign publishers. Sometimes the author agrees, sometimes he doesn't, so the book doesn't come out in the country. There's a few examples of that, and on this second kind of censorship that you just mentioned, Olivia, I would say it's a mix, contrary to the first case where it is institutionalized. We have a mix between sensitive topics in those countries, namely Russia, Turkey, for instance, sensitive topics such as politics, history, religion, sex, homosexuality, and also cultural taboos. And even if it's less systematic than the previous, the countries we mentioned, it can be as dangerous for the publishers to cross the line. So we have to be also very, very careful and carefully select, of course, the book we present to these publishers, and also give up on some topics that we know will be unthinkable in those cultures. But I could give you a few examples, and that's very. It explains a lot of things. For instance, in Turkey, recently, a publisher which happens to have close ties with the government refused a book we publish, even if he published the previous novels of this author, because one of the main characters was gay. So he declined. And for instance, I want to also give the example of the children and young adult books. It's a very sensitive subject in those countries as well, because those books have usually an educational purpose. So it's quite also sensitive. And for instance, in Russia, the laws enforcing child protection are extremely strict. And for instance, any mention of drug, sex, tobacco is banned from children books, and sometimes even in young adult books. And I can give you quite an example. Last year at the Angoulême Comic Fair, several Russian publishers, they pointed out the fact that the best-selling awarded cartoon Mortel Adèle, which seems completely harmless to European eyes, could simply not be publishing in Russia because Adèle, the main character, has two uncles forming a gay couple. So they said it will not be possible to be published in Russia. But I also want to add that in those countries, contrary to the first ones, there are areas of freedom. And for instance, in Turkey, you have historical activist independent publishing house that take the risk to publish unfit books tackling feminism topics or homosexuality topic, and also criticizing the government. So there are some publishing houses still willing to take the risk to publish risky books.
Yeah, there are exceptions to the rule.
Countries.
Yeah. Nora, what do you think about this?
Well, firstly, I forgot to mention this before. Fortunately, Judith said it. Yes, in markets such as China, where I think in the past, when they needed to do cuts and changes and something to make book pass the next step to be approved and to get an ISBN number, because everything evolves around the ISBN numbers in the Chinese system, they just did it without asking, and we never know. We just don't know.
At least they ask now.
And now they ask, exactly. That's what I wanted to say as well. So that's a change. It's an interesting change, and it says something about self-confidence and about. So it's not a secret anymore. It's being discussed. So they ask, can we do those changes? And I mean, it's an ambivalent situation because it puts us in the possibility to discuss with the author. And as Judith said, we have had both cases as well. If it's just about changing a few words that seem innocuous to us and for the author doesn't change the meaning of what he wanted to say, we can probably say yes, and then it's okay. If it touches on the idea of the book, we will say no, and then the book cannot be published. And both happened in the past, even though I must say very rarely. So it's not as if every second Chinese license is being discussed in this way. It happens, I don't know, 1 out of 50 maybe. So it's not happening very often, but it's happening now. And again, we don't have the possibilities and the means to control translations line by line when they come out. So maybe someone tells us after that the book has been published that there are changes, but maybe not. Concerning your second question, I think it's important to make a difference between the political censorship and a social cultural censorship, because the political censorship most probably means, or in many cases means, that it's coming from top to bottom, and that there might be, in the same country where it's applied, there might be a wide readership who resists it and who is interested in certain topics. And then the publishers that Judith mentioned step in, the brave ones, the ones who know how to deal with the system. And that's the ones we are talking to very openly. And we might change a title in order to not attract the political attention on the book, or we might change a few trigger words in the flap text, but the translation itself remains faithful. And that's one way to deal. So that's more about how to publish a book, not to attract the wrong kind of attention to it, but the publisher knows that there's a readership for the book. If there's a social cultural censorship, which means by definition that it arrived in the society already, and it can be very deeply rooted in the society, or it can be just a part of the society affected by it, then that's much more interesting and much more triggering to deal with, because tricky to deal with, because then you either have a niche publisher, and if it's a real niche publisher, she already knows how to deal with it. They know how to serve their audience and not being persecuted for doing so. But if if it's really against, if a book is really against the social cultural DNA of a country, then it doesn't make sense to publish it there anyway, because there won't be readers. And again, that's, I wouldn't call this self-censorship, but it's pragmatism. If I presume there are no readers for a certain topic in a certain country, I wouldn't present a book.
That's a very good point. And this actually leads me to the last question, which is very interesting. I think that in democratic countries, we're seeing more and more of this cancel culture and worries about cultural appropriation. And I'd like to know how this has affected your work. I know that Judith, you've mentioned before the example of Timothée de Fontbelle. So perhaps you can start by talking about that. And
absolutely, this case went public, so I can discuss Timothée de Fontbelle and his young adult book, Alma, which is the story of a little African girl enslaved and shipped to America. And Timothée de Fontbelle's English-speaking publisher declined the book, saying it was cultural appropriation, that basically a white male cannot tell the story of a young Black African girl. So it was stunning for us, of course, worrying, troubling. And you know that this trend has been going on for a while now. The political correctness and the cancel culture affecting the freedom of speech in the Anglo-Saxon countries has been indeed a growing trend in the past few years, and Anglo-Saxon publishers are very worried about lawsuits and also social media's rage fits. So they became very careful and reluctant to tackle sensitive subjects like that. And also, as well, this new form of censorship is quite worrying, and it can be as well also. It can have different degrees as well, from light cuts and adaptations to complete ban of a book. Recently, you have heard that all the Dr. Seuss books were banned for racism, which is quite astonishing for us, but it's the case. At Gallimard, for instance, we recently published a book, a novel about Native Americans, a community of Native Americans, written by a white French female author. And a publisher in the States declined because she found it was cultural appropriation. And recently also, I can quote an American publisher who bluntly wrote to us, "Please stop sending me books written by white males." So
sorry.
This is absolutely astonishing for us, but on a more optimistic tone, I would say that Alma by Timothée de Fontbelle finally found an English-speaking publisher, a brave one, who said to us, "We are ready to defend the book in times as it is today, where hypocrisy, extremism, and ignorance are ready to create confusion and muddle the waters of the political and historical debates." So we have a happy ending about this book, but
that's a great quote, which could be applied to any country, right? No, Nora?
It can be, well, I want to say, and then I leave Nora speak, but I let Nora speak. I think this new form of censorship or self-censorship from the Anglo-Saxon publisher is very insidious and can be extremely damaging to editorial diversity.
Very interesting. Yeah. And Nora, what has your experience been?
Well, it's interesting because actually long before I first heard the expression cultural appropriation, I always had the difficulties to explain why a German author, male or female, would write a book located in France, in Portugal, in Poland, wherever, if there's not a plausible and very apparent personal background of the author, or if the author is half French or is living in Portugal since 20 years, that's somehow accepted, but then it always comes down to the point, in the past at least, how well it is done. So I had those discussions when there was no, when the expression like cultural appropriation didn't have the same weight as it has today. I had those discussions 10 years ago, especially from the English language world. On the other hand, there are also positive, I have positive examples which make me think that it's not as straightforward and clear, and not just only because of the braveness of the individual publisher, but some things seem to be okay. For example, I love the book The Pine Islands by Marion Poschmann. It was on the international Booker shortlist 2 years ago, 3 years ago, recently, and it did so well all over the world. And the book is located in Japan, but the main character is a German middle-aged academic who travels there and brings all his Germanness there. And although he obviously, she described Japanese culture and surrounding, the fact that there was this German in the country makes it possible and acceptable. I think she just did it very well, and so this was accepted. I don't know if it would be accepted today, and I will know in a few months, because we are now I am about to launch to submit the new novel by Stefan Thome, who's one of my wonderful authors whom I really adore, and he's living in Taiwan since 20 years, nearly 15 years, married to a Taiwan woman, and he's now written a novel placed and based in Taiwan. So this is going to be interesting to see how people react on it, and if there is something like the accusation of cultural appropriation. I really don't hope, and I really would dare everybody saying such a thing, but we are going to know in a few months.
Yeah, I guess it's to be continued and to see how this matter evolves. And there's so much to talk about, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. So perhaps we could eventually have a part 2 of this. But I'd like to thank you both very, very much for speaking with us. It's been a real pleasure. And I'd also like to remind listeners that on June 24th, we'll have another coffee break with a focus on podcasts created by publishers, which I hope you'll all attend and listen to. Thank you again, Nora, and thank you again, Judith.
Thank you very much, Olivia.
Thank you, Olivia.
Thank you, Nora.
Thank you, Judith. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Excellent. So I have stopped to record the session. You can now talk free.